and we are Max Weber Fellows at the European University Institute, and we have a privilege here to talk with Professor Michèle Lamont, a cultural and comparative sociologist from Harvard University about, well, your career, and about your agenda for the study of cultural study of inequality and recognition, and then maybe some advice for early career scars.
I'll be very happy to. Thank you for inviting me.
Welcome to the Max Weber program again. So I will start with the first question. And Professor Lamont, we would like to talk a little bit about your fascinating intellectual trajectory that kind of started in Canada, where you grew up. Then you moved to France, where you did your PhD, and then you kind of built your career in the United States. But you kind of keep doing like comparative research. You travel a lot. So maybe can you tell us a little bit more about how this mobility and this trajectory influence your research and the kind of questions you're asking, but maybe also how you see the discipline of sociology also evolving in these different spaces to which we're connected?
That's a great question, and it's a complicated one. There's a lot of layers because, of course, what I did at each step, I didn't know where it would lead me at all. So I started in political theory at the University of Ottawa in the late 70s, which was then very much a Marxist, neo-Marxist place. And I did the studies of my master's thesis was on Lenin's conception of class consciousness and his epistemology, the relation between subject and object. And curiously enough, that's very much at the center of cultural sociology because it's about causality and the relationship between ideology and material conditions. When I went to Paris, my mentor, who had been a student of Marcuse and Henri Lefebvre, sent me to Paris to work with a friend of his who was an expert in the pre-socialist thinkers, Proudhon and Fourier. And it was in the department in the sociology of knowledge at Jussieu, which I must say was not a very good department. There were very few faculty, and there were tons of students who, like me, I had the fellowship from the French government. You know, the French government was giving fellowship to basically, therefore, their former colonies to facilitate, you know, the diffusion of Francophonie and French influenced sociology. But very shortly after I got there, I was basically, I got a boyfriend who was Brazilian, who had studied with Michel de Certeau, and he told me the action is there. And there was the Pierre Bourdieu seminar. And just shortly after Distinction came out, and it was super exciting. I had already read Bourdieu before coming to France. I knew that this was extremely novel. So I kind of joined that group. Bourdieu agreed to work with me, to supervise me. He was a terrible supervisor of women for all kinds of reasons that I will not explain. He was not a particularly nice person. I think he thought of women and often of students as tools for his own agenda. So, but anyway, I learned a lot. And then I decided not to work with him anymore because I felt I couldn't trust him. So I returned to my original idea for my dissertation, which was on the very rapid growth of the social sciences and the decline of the humanities in Quebec between 1960 and 1980. So it was a sociology of knowledge kind of question. As the state was becoming a technocratic state, philosophy and theology, which had been at the top of the hierarchy of discipline, fell to the bottom while economics became the dominant discipline. So I was very interested in these questions. And then when I finished, there was very few jobs in Canada, and I was quite anxious because I had never done anything else. So I applied for postdocs, and you will find this very funny. There was a postdoc offered by Canadian government, and I had to find someone who would host me. So I wrote to 3 people. One was Randall Collins, who had no job at the time because his wife taught is a judge, and she worked in San Diego, and he decided to quit his job at Virginia to be with her. So he wrote back and he said, sorry, I cannot host you. I don't have a job. And then I wrote to Alvin Goldner, who had just died. And the third person I wrote to was Seymour Martin Lipset, who was at Stanford. And Lipset agreed. He sent me a telegram saying, sure, come. And it happened that Lipset had started his career in Canada, and he had done a lot of work in the sociology of higher education. So we really shared some interest, and he was a very generous person. And I was very lucky because he had already mentored Tita Scotch-Paul and Swidler. So at the time, now we're talking, I got there in 78. No, sorry, in 82. There was not, no, yeah, 82. There were very few men of his generation who were super supportive of women. So I was very lucky. And when I got there, I had to learn to write in English. So I know that for a lot of Max Weber's scholars, you face the same, you know, like basically you go to a new place and you don't know what's ahead of you. And then I fell in love with my husband, who is a sociologist, Frank Dobbin. And we knew it would be very difficult to get jobs together in Canada. No one was hiring couples at the time. But anyway, I went on job market first because I was ahead of him, and I got a job at University of Texas at Austin. And I had been in the US just for 2 years, and I had a much thicker accent than I do now. And I really didn't want to go there, but I was thrilled to have a job. And it was a good job because the department was pretty highly ranked. So our strategy was just to get the best job possible, both of us, and then eventually to try to converge. And Frank finished, I think, a year or two later, and he took a job at Indiana University. So it was very, you know, we commuted basically for a year and a half, but it was not too bad. And all this to say, the takeaway for the postdocs that are here now is, you know, there was just a lot of uncertainty, but we just did what we could, you know, each step, hoping that we would be able to maximize what would be optimal for both of us at each point. And it worked out because after we were both in those universities and we just like worked to publish because it was all about publishing. And I must say, as a woman and an immigrant, I preferred the American system because I felt like it was less dependent on networks and clientelism, and I just had to publish a lot. And when I had the work with Bourdieu, he had asked me to do interviews with philosophers on the kind of sociology of philosophy project that eventually he led to his book Homo Academicus. And I gave him a sample of the kind of studies that I thought I could do. And that was the first iteration of my paper, How to Become a Dominant French Philosopher, the case of Jacques Derrida, which became quite famous because it was accepted in American Journal of Sociology. And it was a funny paper because it explained that Derrida became famous for a very different reason, and for philosophers in France and for what then became post-structuralism in the US. But this is the paper that allowed me to be hired at the University of Texas at Austin. And it was the department that mostly had demographers. But at the time, there was David Snow, who is a leader in the sociology of social movement. And he was very Goffmanian. He was working on frame analysis and how homeless people understand their identity at the time. So I was super lucky, frankly, because those people found my work interesting and they took a gamble on me. And then Princeton, which was frankly not a very good department at the time, had done some soul searching and decided to specialize in several fields, one of them being cultural sociology and another one being economic sociology, which was my husband's field. So they hired us, and we were not the first on the list. They offered the job to a couple of other people before we got the offers. And it was very risky because they had had a lot of assistant professors who had left. It's a place where very few people were getting tenure. So we took the gamble. We felt like at least we'll be together. And so I think the takeaway from all this is really, if you operate, I think even if you operate in a system which is extremely clientelistic, you have to publish a lot. Because I remember when I came up for tenure at Princeton, Viviana Zelizer was the chair of the department, and she told me, your publications are your passport. And she was very right. You know, my first book, Money, Morals, and Manners, she told me, well, whether or not you get tenure, you know, you're going to have this book which will give you tenure elsewhere. So what's most important is that your first book be really well received. And because I did not turn my dissertation into a publication, I felt like a study of the transformation of the world of social science in Quebec would not be of sufficient interest. It would not give me tenure. So, and because my husband taught at Indiana, and I had been at Stanford, this is where having a comparative perspective was very, very helpful. I think living in different contexts where the upper middle class was very different from the French upper middle class, I could see how Bourdieu's theory didn't work, and that he was very blind to moral boundaries. So if you want my living experience, and for instance, in Indiana, where when people make cultural distinction, they mostly talk about people who are phonies, which in French, you know, it's like the equivalent in French is a bit like lack of integrity or intellectual integrity. So clearly there was a lot of forms of distinction that Bourdieu totally overlooked. So I had the vision of what the criticism of an empirically grounded criticism of Bourdieu could be. And I was lucky because just at that time, the work of Bourdieu was becoming more and more known in the US. But there were lots of people who were just, you know, adoring Bourdieu and not, you know, doing empirically based criticism. So I was in some ways ahead of the curve, because that's another story altogether. Giddens was starting the Polity book series, and he asked me to write a book on Bourdieu, and I read a lot of what was available then, and I went to Paris to do interviews with a lot of people, and then I decided not to write this book because it was clear I was going to be a critical analysis of Bourdieu, and he didn't want me to write this book. So I felt like, well, if I write this book, he's going to say it's not good. So, you know, so I decided to abandon the project. But because I had read so much of his book, of his work, I felt self-assured enough to I felt I could write what became Animals and Manners, which, you know, the last chapter is a very fundamental criticism of his work, of the concept of field as a zero-sum game. So, and, you know, because of my training also in political theory, I think I felt like I could do theoretically based criticism as well. So when I came up for tenure at Princeton in 1992, the book was not out yet, but it was finished, so the university could circulate it. So the big question was, how were people going to react to this book? And the way you get tenure in these big American universities is that they send letters to like 20 people in the country, and they tell them, please read that book and tell us what you think. And is Michèle Lamont one of the most, you know, up and coming? And the response was positive, but it was a surprise to me, and it was a surprise to my colleagues, you know, because there was just a lot of uncertainty. So I remember very well thinking at the time, like something like long-term pain for long-term gain, that, you know, I was taking risks all along, and my husband was as well. So I think for postdocs in the Max Weber program, in some ways you're at the same stage, you know, you're operating in an environment where you don't know at all what's ahead, what are the jobs that you're going to get. And of course, there's an element of luck, right? Inequality, sociology of inequality, we always talk about the determinants of upward mobility, but luck is a huge element. And I was lucky several times, but on the other hand, you also have to be ready to benefit from luck when it comes your way. And the fact that both Frank and I were, you know, very determined to stay together. So I must say our personal commitment to each other and the fact that we had jobs together was really, and we didn't want also, you know, in the US, we talk about trailing spouses. So cases where, you know, university wants like the man and then they hired a woman just to get the man. Because we were more or less at the same stage professionally, we didn't want, we were not, neither of us were trailing spouses. You know, our career advanced at the same time. So that was also an advantage because the departments that hired us never felt like they were doing us a favor, you know. So I think it's not just a meritocratic story that I'm talking, because we don't want to be overly naive about meritocracy. But on the other hand, there are several, you know, forks in the road that presented themselves to us where we took, like, I could have gone to Indiana, I could have come to Texas, but neither of us wanted to live there for a different reason. I'm French Canadian, my family is in Quebec, and Frank is from Boston, so being in the Northeast was important to us. But you know, the fact that we thought, and I thought as a an immigrant, I felt, okay, this is a far more meritocratic system in the sense that if you get publication, at some point your publication list is big enough that you become attractive to departments. So we were just putting our energy on this. And also, having done my studies in France, and France was still at the time, there were not many foreigners being hired at all. And being French Canadian, there was certainly a strong element of paternalism toward French Canadians. And, you know, it was a post-colonial society that was deeply, deeply colonial in their approach to people with accents. So I felt like this is not even a possibility, you know. So, and when I went to the US, I absolutely didn't want to live in the US. You know, I, like many Quebecois, was looking down at the materialism of American society. But I was very young. I finished, I was 25, and I got this fellowship. And I was burned out. I had the kind of mental breakdown as I was finishing my dissertation. I was just exhausted and I didn't want to be an academic anymore. But then I had this postdoc, which forced me to finish by a certain date in order to not lose my postdoc. So I did that. And I'll tell you, when I arrived at Stanford as a postdoc, I met a good friend who was Mexican, and we spent like a month or two just smoking marijuana together and relaxing. And it allowed me to get back on my feet, you know, and become again enthusiastic about my research. But the fact that I had never done anything meant like I was nervous about going on the job market. And then because Stanford was such a top university, it was so difficult to be on the job market when I was not getting many interviews. The first year I went, I had only one job offered to me, which was at the University of Texas, University of Houston, where I would not have worked with graduate students. So I decided not to take it. And I taught part-time in the department. And that's the one time when my parents helped me financially. You know, they gave me like 10,000, so I would be able to go through that year. But it was a very good decision, because if I had gone there, I would never have had the opportunities I had later from being in a department where there were graduate students, where I could do research, like more research focused. Yeah, so the takeaway for me is, yes, it takes a lot of luck, but you also have to make sure that you have on your file what is needed. And sometimes you have to make the choices you don't want to make. Like I didn't want to go to UT Austin, you know, Texas is it's difficult for foreigners because it's a place that is extremely regionalist and in some way provincial, you know, because there are all kinds of factors there. So, but you know, at the end, it worked out and it served me well, because it would have been harder to move to a better university if I had gone to a small university on the East Coast. So this is, you know, I'm telling you all this just to say this is how we thought about our professional trajectory. Now, in terms of substance, there's no doubt in my mind that the fact that I had this cross-national experience allowed me to do sociology. When I started, I had no idea I would write a book that would be a comparison of Indianapolis, New York, Paris, and Clermont-Ferrand. And that really came out of my experience of living in Indianapolis in New York and connecting what I thought were the theoretical blind spots of Bourdieu with what I could experience on the ground. So, you know, maintaining the dialectic between observation and theory and data collection and formalization. So very early on, I had a very kind of pragmatic approach to coming up with problems, and also in some ways trusting my guts about what was an interesting question. And also trying to avoid what I perceive was very formalist, you know, formulaic way of asking questions. So when I went to Stanford, Popper, you know, it was an extremely positivistic department. And it was difficult because having studied with Bourdieu, and Bourdieu was not that well known in 1983 when I got there. And the guy who taught theory said to me, he was an old functionalist, a student of Parson. He said, oh yes, you studied with Bourdieu. Well, Bourdieu, Baudrillard are the same thing, you know, like they were really deeply ignorant of European sociology. And very close by, there was Berkeley, which was way better informed. But Stanford was very good at training graduate students. So that's really where I learned to write and understand how you get your papers in journals. And I think if I had gone to Berkeley, at the time, Berkeley was really not good at professionalizing its students. So I learned a lot there. So in some ways, putting myself in a position that was not necessarily most interesting for me, but where I learned what was most important for me to be able to move forward, served me very well. And there at Stanford, there was also Annette Lareau, who became very well known too, was also very interested in Bourdieu. And she had gone to Berkeley and she had studied with Michael Bourvoy and Arlie Hochschild. And like me, she didn't have, in France, there were very, very little professionalization training. So both of us were equally clueless, but we were lucky. And the Stanford department was extremely normative. It really provided people kind of formula. What do you need to do to succeed? And some of the students were too much into what I would call hoop jumping, like show me what hoop you can jump and I'll jump it. And I think both of us in some ways were more connected to our instinct of what we thought would be good sociology. And I think that served us, both of us, very well, because on the long term, you don't want to lose the sacred fire. A lot of people stop producing at some point, like they would get tenure and then stop producing because they just get bored. So if you don't remain connected to what is really interesting to you intellectually, it's very easy to dry up, or people become administrators. A lot of people think, oh, what's the point of writing if no one reads me? And then they become dean or something, So it's not necessarily the most attractive path for me, at least. I've done some administration and realized this is not as interesting as doing research. So yeah.
So the next question, which you kind of already answered, is connected to the kind of second pillar of the Max Weber program, which would be the interdisciplinarity. And it struck me when I read your I think it was 2017 address at the American Sociological Association, when I think you pushed the agenda for the study of the cultural study of inequality and recognition, that you actually call sociologists to maybe unite with policymakers and really think more about like how to address inequality, how to kind of create a more just society, right? So the question would be, where do you think, like since 2017, where this kind of marriage of sociology with maybe policy making, but also other discipline is going?
Yeah, well, I think that the main point I made in this paper is that a lot of policies are stigmatizing. So think about food stamps, when they were created, low-income people would go to a grocery store with their food stamp card to get free food. And this was, of course, a very stigmatizing situation. So the idea was to try to get policymakers or policy students, their training was very economic. So the question of how different policies stigmatize people was not at all on their agenda. And at Harvard, there's the Kennedy School for Government, which was very much dominated by economists. There were some sociologists there, including my very good friend and mentor, William Julius Wilson, and Sandy Jenks, who became a good friend. But there was no thought, that's a generation of sociologists who always put emphasis on structure, and a lot of culture they thought was just blah, blah, in part because they were the product of the behavioral revolution of the 60s, Skinnerism, and the idea that, only material resources really matter. So, and of course, Bourdieu really helped us understand the role of culture in reproduction inequality, and that's where I came from intellectually. So I'm totally acknowledging that there. But also I had been involved for 19 years coordinating or co-leading a very interdisciplinary group of people studying successful societies. So basically, how to help people cope and, overcome the challenges that come with inequality. So I had gained, if you will, self-confidence in my thinking about, not my individual case, but collectively, we looked at, for instance, epidemiologists talk about the allostatic load, the wear and tear of everyday life that comes with experiencing inequality or racism. So because I was working on racism at the time, I was very interested in thinking about how cultural sociology can help us understand better how people can cope with racism. So that was an example of an interdisciplinary exchange that led me to think about the theoretical problems I was working on very differently. So for me, it was extremely generative. And I think things have changed a lot because at least even 10 years ago, and Harvard and MIT, I mean, this is the place where you have the most extremely influential economists in the world. They are in that town. So Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they're extremely, extremely influential. And sometimes they are not fully considerate toward what is done in sociology. So Acemoglu, Darren Acemoglu, and Robinson, James Robinson, who won this year's Nobel Prize in economics, they study the process of institutionalization. Institutions, well, that's a topic about which sociologists have written forever, and they wrote books on this without citing sociologists ever. So, problems like this to me are very infuriating because it's a little bit like we try to do interdisciplinarity, but economists are very well known for mostly citing economists. So on the other hand, frankly, I think it's their loss because sociology has really prospered. I think we're lucky that our discipline is multi-paradigmatic and it allows us to connect with all kinds of other disciplines. So it's very difficult though, because economists are so good at defending their self-interest. The whole model is based on self-interest, and they are really good at esprit de corps. They fall in line, and they always, even the most heterodox economists will define economics. So whereas sociologists tend to be very self-critical. So if you want to take the case of French sociology, for instance, there's been a number of fights in the pages of Le Monde. So the sociologists are just washing their dirty clothes in public all the time, which really weakens the discipline, I think. So I think, those are the weaknesses of our discipline. Like a lot of people are self-hating sociologists. They don't have a sense of the need for us to manage our collective professional status together and do some, make sure that we don't look foolish, if you will, in public. So.
All right, so for the last 5 minutes we have, maybe mention a bit information about your latest book, Seeing Others. So I'll just give you a few hints and you will answer as you want. So if you could restate in a few sentences the overall argument and maybe perhaps state the context in which you wrote the book. Why did you write it? Who is it addressed to? And maybe give, because I think it's one of your first trade books for a greater audience, what were the challenges you had during writing? And I also read that you were pushing for sociologists so they can have better impact. So is that for you, this book, a way to raise impact? And
Sure. Yeah, so I decided to write that book during the first Trump presidency because I was depressed. So I read the literature on hope, and the literature on hope tells us, well, people gain hope from being exposed to new narratives. So there's a growing literature on how people project themselves into the future. And so I became interested in studying people who produce new narratives, because after 40 years of growing inequality and neoliberalism, the American dream felt very much out of reach for many people, which fed a very deep mental health crisis in the US, including in the upper middle class, where young people are really pushed to be, always oriented toward upward mobility. And in the context where this book emerged, I became very attuned to the fact that some of the alternative narratives that were being produced in Hollywood and in many other organizational fields were emphasizing inclusion and diversity. So the book is really in-depth look at, first, it explains to the general audience what is a narrative and the role of narrative in fostering greater social inclusion. So it's in some ways a very elementary book. Sometimes when I think about the book, I think it presents in a way that I hope is accessible tools that the social scientists have developed to, like, social movement. A lot of the book repeats stuff that is already in the social movement literature. So I'm not claiming that all of this is original, but it was indeed an attempt to intervene in the public sphere by writing a book that would be, and it has become much more widely read than my other books that were written for academics. And I was lucky because there was an agent, Margot Fleming, who took the book and, you know, convinced Simon and Schuster to buy it, and Pantheon. So these publishers have means of, you know, scaling up the diffusion of a book. At the same time, producing a trade book is something very complicated because you have to be ready to do a lot of things that we don't do normally. So they wanted me like to be on social media and brag each time I was invited to give a talk somewhere, which I did somewhat, but it made me very uncomfortable because as academics, we're not used to doing this. This is now not how it works, you know. So part of it I disliked and part of it I liked. And on the other hand, I think at the end of the day, the book has been like I was on a radio show that is oriented toward truck drivers, and they have 1 million truck drivers listening. So, you know, and the book is about recognition. So talking about the working class and recognition to working class people, I think was very meaningful. So it allowed me to reach out to, but it was such a big challenge, you know. So I feel at this point, the new book that I've started working on, which is in part about workers, will reach out some, but on the other hand, I'm much clearer about what I'm willing to do. And also, you know, I want to continue to write the more theoretically driven articles for sure. So finding the right balance between the various things that I want to do is important for me at this stage in my life, you know.
Do you think that there is a lesson there for sociologists also of like how they write, that next to like conducting research and next to, you know, analysis is also the question how sociologists write their narratives.
Yeah, I remember at some point talking with Charles Tilly about this, and Tilly, who was enormously prolific, said, well, you know, I have different tables, and it's not because I write this style here that I will not write another style there. So I think sometimes sociologists are too harsh with each other, like the narcissism of small differences, I think can be extremely counterproductive. So I would say when we write, it's important to have a clear vision of who we want to engage with. I think it's important to engage in conversation with our peers on very, you know, specific questions of theory. That is important because that's where the fundamental development of the discipline happens. But at the same time, if we always only talk to each other about hyper-specialized questions, there's a lot that we miss. And it's important, I think, to make time to do this. And I know that your generation, you're very interested in writing, you know, publications that have a wider reach to have an impact on the social media, et cetera. So I think it's great. But at the same time, we're not journalists. We don't want to be hacks, you know, who just repeat common sense that journalists are saying. So keeping a clear vision of what we have to contribute that is distinctive from what journalists do is really, really important.
So I think that we need to ask last one question, because this is the last meeting in our program in 2024. We are into 2025. So maybe the question is about, hope.
Hope, yes.
Or sociology of hope, or what would be the message that you would that you would give?
So the book Seeing Others, I like to describe it as a very hopeful book because the takeaway is that there's proliferation of narratives that are being produced all the time and scaled up and diffused. So even like now we're talking, it's been a month since Trump was elected. There's a lot of reason to be, for me at least, for people who are progressive or liberal, to be frankly depressed. So I'm not reading the newspapers very much lately because I feel the people he's appointing is just a disaster. But at the same time, this production of alternative representation of what a good life is ongoing. So, you know, Bush used to talk about, George W. Bush, 1,000 points of light, to talk about basically the world of philanthropy. Well, I think the same thing holds, you know. This production of visions of social change is ongoing, and we're all doing our bit every day. And I certainly feel that I do this too when I teach undergrads. So if you keep your eye on this and think that, you know, like even Trump, he, you know, the majority of Americans didn't vote for him. He barely has majority in Congress, you know. So while we can all experience what's happening right now, or even all the radical right governments that are being elected in Europe, I think it's more like the balance of power is way more precarious than we would want it to be. But at the same time, there's a lot of people who share a more inclusive vision of social life who are out there. So I think like you don't want to lose this momentum. And it's very important for us to think about, you know, the ways in which the glass is half full, not only half empty. So
thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank
With
you
hope
very much.
we end the conversation.
and thank you
so
to
much.
both of you for your questions.
Thank you.
You're welcome.